I didn't say a word when the HOA president screamed about unauthorized reconstruction and property violations. I just placed the federal military housing protection order on the conference table and watched their lawyer's face drain of color. The room went dead silent, except for the sound of Mrs. Henderson's coffee cup rattling against her saucer as her hands started shaking. 23 months of harassment, fines, and legal threats had led to this moment, and I was going to save her. Every second of watching them realize exactly how badly they'd miscalculated before all this started. I had a simple life planned out. After 15 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, I'd bought a modest 2-acre plot in Pine Ridge Estates because it reminded me of my childhood home in rural Montana. The property came with a small ranch house and enough space to build a workshop, where I could restore old motorcycles and maybe do some woodworking projects once I retired. And the neighborhood was quiet. It's mostly military families and retirees who understood the value of keeping to themselves and maintaining their properties, without making a fuss about every blade of grass or fence post. I wasn't looking for community drama or neighborhood politics. I just wanted to come home from my deployments to a place where I could work with my hands, listen to classic rock on an old radio, and decompress from whatever hellhole the Army had sent me to that year. The workshop I built was nothing fancy. It's just a 24 by 30 steel building with proper electrical, it's concrete floors, and enough space for a lift and all my tools. I'd pulled the proper permits from the county, had everything inspected, and even checked with the HOA before I started construction. The response I got was a form letter saying that outbuildings were allowed as long as they met county codes and weren't visible from the street. My workshop sat behind my house, completely screened by a row of mature pine trees I'd planted specifically for privacy. I spent my weekends there restoring a 1973 Honda CB750 and building furniture for the UHR, for the UHRLCE, for the UHRLCE, furniture for the UHRLCE completely screened by a row of mature pine trees I'd planted specifically for privacy. I spent my weekends. House. It was my sanctuary, the place where the stress of military life melted away, and I could just be a guy working on projects I actually cared about. That's when the HOA started paying attention to me. It began with a violation notice taped to my front door while I was at work, claiming my workshop was non-compliant with architectural standards and demanding I submit architectural plans for approval. This was 18 months after I'd built the thing. The violation came from a new HOA board that had taken power after the previous president moved away. The new leadership was headed by Margaret Henderson, a retired school principal who seemed to view the neighborhood as her personal kingdom to micromanage. Her first act was to hire a property management company to enforce community standards more rigorously, which apparently meant driving around looking for violations that previous boards had ignored. I tried handling it the right way. I submitted copies of my original county permits, photos showing the workshop wasn't visible from any street or common area, and a letter explaining that the structure had been approved by the previous board. The response was a formal hearing notice demanding I appear before the Architectural Review Committee to justify the unauthorized structure. At that hearing, Mrs. Henderson informed me that the previous board's approval was informal and not binding, and that all structures required written approval from the current board. She then handed me a packet of forms that would cost $500 in fees to process and require architectural drawings from a licensed professional, which would run another $1,200 for a workshop that had been legally built and properly permitted to. Years earlier, when I pointed out that the workshop met all county codes and HOA bylaws, Mrs. Henderson's response was that compliance isn't just about rules. It's about maintaining the character and property values of our community. She suggested I might be more comfortable in a neighborhood with less stringent standards and reminded me that continued violations would result in daily fines and possible legal action. The committee voted unanimously to give me 60 days to either get proper approval or remove the structure entirely. I walked out of that meeting understanding exactly what kind of people I was dealing with, but I still believed the system would work if I followed the proper procedures. Over the next few months, I submitted their paperwork, paid their fees, and jumped through every hoop they put in front of me. The architectural drawings were rejected for insufficient detail. The revised drawings were rejected for inappropriate materials. The third set was rejected because the building was too industrial for a residential neighborhood. Each rejection came with new requirements and additional fees. Meanwhile, I was getting violation notices every week. The daily fines were accumulating. Mrs. Henderson made a point of driving by my house regularly, sometimes stopping to take photos of my property with her phone. The message was clear. They wanted me gone. They were going to make my life miserable until I gave up and moved. Then I got deployment orders for Afghanistan. 9 months with the 412th Engineer Command helping rebuild infrastructure in Helmand Province. I tried to explain to the HOA board that I was being deployed and requested a suspension of all proceedings until I returned. Mrs. Henderson's response was that military service doesn't exempt anyone from community obligations, that I should have considered my HOA responsibilities before choosing to leave. She helpfully suggested I could hire a property management company to handle HOA matters in my absence, at my own expense, or face the consequences of noncompliance. I spent my deployment trying to manage HOA, harassment from 7,000 miles away. My neighbor, a retired Air Force sergeant named Tom Martinez, agreed to keep an eye on my property and forward any HOA correspondence. The violation notices kept coming. Grass too long, newspapers piling up. Workshops still non-compliant. The fines accumulated week by week. And I was handling HOA business via satellite internet from a forward operating base, while dodging mortar rounds and trying to keep Afghan contractors from stealing our construction materials. 3 months into my deployment, Tom called me over a crackling satellite connection with news that made my blood freeze. The HOA had obtained a court order declaring my workshop a public nuisance and had scheduled it for demolition. They claimed I had abandoned the approval process by failing to respond to their final compliance demands. Tom had tried to intervene, showing them my deployment papers and offering to represent me at hearings. But Mrs. Henderson informed him that only property owners could address the board, and since I was unavailable to fulfill my obligations, they were proceeding with enforcement action. By the time I could arrange emergency leave to deal with the situation, it was too late. I flew back from Afghanistan to find my workshop reduced to a pile of twisted metal and concrete rubble. 2 years of work, thousands of dollars in tools, my motorcycle restoration project, handmade furniture I'd crafted for my home, all of it destroyed. The demolition crew had pulled everything out and dumped it in a construction dumpster like it was garbage. Mrs. Henderson had scheduled the demolition for the day after my neighbor left town to visit his sick mother, ensuring no one would be there to witness or document what happened. The HOA's letter, waiting in my mailbox, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic cruelty. They had charged me $8,400 for the demolition, plus accumulated fines totaling $12,600, plus legal fees of $3,200. They were placing a lien on my property for the full amount and would initiate foreclosure proceedings if I didn't pay within 30 days. Mrs. Henderson had included a handwritten note suggesting this was an opportunity to reconsider whether Pine Ridge Estates is the right community for someone with my lifestyle. That night, sitting in my empty house surrounded by deployment gear and staring at the concrete pad where my workshop used to stand, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to fight this through their system anymore. I was going to destroy them using the one thing they had never bothered to research: federal military housing protections. I spent the next 3 weeks in the base law library, reading every federal statute, military regulation, and court precedent related to service member housing rights. What I found was better than I had hoped. The Service Members Civil Relief Act wasn't just about pausing legal proceedings. During deployment, it included specific protections for military housing and property rights. Any action taken against a service member's primary residence while they were deployed could be challenged as a violation of federal law, with penalties that included treble damages and attorney fees. But the real gem was buried in Department of Defense housing regulations. Any property purchased with VA loan benefits and occupied as a primary residence automatically qualified for military housing protection status. This meant that not only had the HOA violated federal law by destroying my property during deployment, but they had also committed what amounted to destruction of federal military housing. The penalties for that could include criminal charges and forfeiture of any HOA authority over military protected properties. I filed a federal complaint with the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Judge Advocate General's office, and the U.S. Attorney for our district. I documented everything, the timeline showing I was deployed when the demolition occurred, the correspondence proving the HOA knew about my military status, the violation of due process in their demolition order, and the financial damage they had caused. I also requested an investigation into whether the HOA board had acted with criminal intent by targeting military properties for harassment. The response was swift and devastating. Within 2 weeks, Mrs. Henderson received a federal cease and desist order prohibiting any further collection actions against my property. The HOA's attorney withdrew from representation after reviewing the federal complaint. The property management company immediately suspended all activities pending legal review. And then came the demand letter from the Department of Justice. The HOA had 30 days to provide complete documentation of their actions, including all board meeting minutes, correspondence, and financial records related to my case. That's when I scheduled my appearance at the next HOA board meeting. I didn't announce what I was planning or give them any advance warning. I just showed up at the scheduled meeting in the community clubhouse, wearing my dress uniform with all my deployment ribbons, carrying a manila folder containing copies. Of all the federal documents I'd filed, Mrs. Henderson tried to have me removed from the meeting, claiming I was in default and had no standing to address the board. I set the federal military housing protection order on the table in front of her and watched the color drain from her face as she read the Department of Justice letterhead. The room went completely silent as I explained, in the same calm voice I'd used to brief colonels on engineering projects, exactly what federal laws they had violated and what penalties they were facing. The demolition of military-protected housing during deployment was a federal crime. The financial harassment of deployed service members was a violation of the SCRA. The targeting of military families for HOA enforcement could be prosecuted as discrimination under federal civil rights law. Mrs. Henderson's hands were shaking as she tried to respond, mumbling something about just following HOA procedures and not knowing about military protections. I let her finish, then placed copies of my deployment orders on the table, the same deployment orders I had provided to the board 18 months earlier when requesting a suspension of proceedings. I reminded the room that I had explicitly informed them of my military status and deployment, and that they had proceeded with demolition anyway. Claiming military service doesn't exempt anyone from community obligations. The transformation in that room was immediate and complete. Board members who had supported Mrs. Henderson's aggressive enforcement started demanding answers about why they hadn't been informed of federal military protections. The HOA's interim attorney, who had been brought in after their regular counsel quit, confirmed that the association was facing potential criminal charges and civil penalties that could bankrupt the community. Mrs. Henderson tried to maintain control, insisting they had acted within their rights. But her voice was barely a whisper and her authority had evaporated. Within 60 days, the entire HOA board had resigned. Mrs. Henderson moved out of the neighborhood, rather than face the daily reminders of her defeat. The property management company settled my federal complaint for $47,000 in damages and attorney fees. The HOA's insurance carrier paid for complete reconstruction of my workshop, including compensation for all the tools and projects that had been destroyed. They also removed all fines and liens from my property and issued a formal apology that was mailed to every homeowner in the community. But the real victory was the federal oversight that came with the settlement. The Department of Veterans Affairs now maintains a watch list of HOA communities that have violated military housing protections, and Pine Ridge Estates will be on that list for the next 10 years. Any future complaints from military families will trigger an immediate federal investigation. The new HOA board, elected after the mass resignations, implemented policies specifically protecting military families and prohibiting enforcement actions during deployments. Now, when I work in my rebuilt workshop, I can hear Mrs. Henderson's old house sitting empty 3 streets over, still for sale after 8 months on the market. The neighbors who used to ignore me now wave when I drive by. and several have stopped by to apologize for not standing up to the old board. Tom Martinez likes to joke that I should run for HOA president myself, but I have no interest in power, games, or neighborhood politics. I just wanted a quiet place to work on my motorcycles and build furniture. Now I have that, plus the satisfaction of knowing that no other military family in this community will face what I went through. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just winning, it's making sure the bullies can never hurt. Anyone else the same way again? The 1973 Honda CB750 I was restoring when this all started is finally running again. I took it for a ride past Mrs. Henderson's empty house last weekend, and I'll admit the irony wasn't lost on me. She tried to destroy my sanctuary, and instead she destroyed herself. These days when people ask me about HOA problems, I tell them the same thing I learned in the Army. Never fight fair with people who don't fight fair, but always fight smart, and always fight within the law. The law is on your side more often than you think. You just have to be willing to do the research and follow through with the paperwork. Military housing protections exist for a reason. They have real teeth when you know how to use them. Mrs. Henderson learned that lesson the hard way. And now, it's part of the permanent record for anyone else who thinks they can push around military families. Some lessons are worth learning the hard way, especially when the people